a lot of you know Jon, so I'm not going to do a big introduction, but his official title is he's the clinical director of Minding Your Mind, which is a great organization. I'm suspecting he's going to tell us more about. Jon has an extensive experience working with families and students and educators. He's particularly known for some of his great work with teenagers and has done a lot of presentations both in training programs, both for CHNA as a whole, but also individually with a number of our communities, including ours, Woburn. So with no further ado, let's pass things over to Jon and his presentation.
Okay, thank you, David. I appreciate it. Everyone can hear me. Nod, David, everyone can hear me. Everyone can see the screen. That's great. Thank you for being here. I know so many people who are tuned in today. Probably Jacqueline Apps, I've known since like, I think 1842. Some of the people I've known more recently. I'm really happy to be back here. And of course, this all started a zillion years ago when I was doing that 4-part presentation, symposium, which we only had 3 parts, called The Kids Will Be All Right, Creating and Using Protective Approaches to Enhance Youth Mental Health. That seems like it was so long ago. And of course, our world is different. Had I explained to you back then what our world would be like, you would have thought I was insane. It just was not fathomable. But here we are, and what we're going to do over the next hour and a half or so, and we will have you out on time, is to talk about that. There'll be lots of opportunities for you to play a role in this. So there's going to be times when I'm going to be speaking. And again, we'll have some questions at the end. David is going to be looking at the questions, also Randy and Dan too. So one thing you are going to need for this, you are going to need a piece of paper. So just a blank sheet of paper. And I know my file, the screen, the stuff is up on the left-hand side. I know you can see that. That's fine, because I'm going to have to toggle back and forth, and that's going to make it a little easier. So you are going to need just a plain sheet of paper. If you can grab it, we're going to try to do some interactive stuff, even though we can't be as fully interactive as we want. And while I like doing webinars, I think I've done 60 to 70 of them. It's really frustrating because we all like being together. And so this is both exciting and frustrating at the same time. But I'm really glad you're here this morning. I'm glad we had so many people who have come on to be a part of this. So we're going to launch right in. And you may have seen this quote before. Obviously, we're dealing with 2 crises at the exact same time, and they're impacting each other. This was just beyond comprehension. I mean, dealing with COVID-19, I was walking with my daughter. We were outside in the South End yesterday, and everyone had a mask. And I said to her, can you imagine this would have been just out of the question, 8, 10 months ago. But this is our world now. And in fact, somebody who didn't have a mask, that just seemed odd to us. And of course, we're dealing with racial equity issues. And this quote, I think, really makes sense to me. My own personal feeling is around the racial equity issues is just to learn and to read. So I've done a lot of that. And around COVID is to follow science and just to be flexible. During this presentation, we're not going to be doing anything about politics. I know everything is political. How the heck did masks become political? I don't know how that happened. But we are going to be really talking about what's going on, how this relates to our mental health, and giving you some support because you are carrying so much as school people, as community people, and you also are people who have your own personal lives, your own personal challenges. So we're going to do that. So now I'm going to ask you to grab that piece of paper, and I've got mine here. I'm hoping you'll have it here. I can see a couple people here. I can see Dan, I can see Randy. Oh, they're good. David, you don't got it, but that's okay. All right, there you go. I want you to take this piece of paper and I want you to crunch it up into the smallest ball that you can. Just crunch it up as small as you can. Just as small as you can, yeah. Well, this is what this webinar is all about. Before our world was very knowable. It was flat. It was predictable. We were very familiar with it. But our world literally got crunched up just like this small ball. And that doesn't feel so good. So now what I want you to do, I want you to take this crunched up piece of paper and I want you to unfurl it and I want you to try to return it to its original form. So I'm going to do that here. Use a desktop, use your knee, use a ruler, whatever you want, and let's try to get it back to its original form. Yeah. Okay. So this is what mine looks like. I can see a couple others people here. And yeah, David's is kind of like mine. Dan too. Randy also. Yeah, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to return to our normal way of life. We're trying to unfurl that piece of paper and make it predictable and knowable. Get back to the norms that we probably took a little bit for granted. But as you can see from this piece of paper, we are not able to do that as much as we want to be there. And if you hold it up to the light, you can see little lines in there and creases. And those lines represent anger, represent depression, represent frustration, represent a lot of things. This is a really good visual model if you're a teacher, if you work with community groups, because visual models are things that people remember, but our world has been crunched. And again, trying to return it to its original form is just not possible right now for us. And supporting mental health has never been so critical as it is now. We've learned so many terms, we didn't even want to learn those terms, like PPE. We never knew what that meant. Or safer at home was only something I heard from my grandmother, who was happy that we were home all the time. And of course, in the very beginning, we were in a sprint around safety. You know, how do we acquire food? How are we going to have our homes be safe? What are we going to do? At the same time, we knew it was going to be a long process, a marathon. If you were a sprinter, you'd be training in one way very differently than a marathoner, but you were doing the same, both at the same time. And it was exhausting. You might have gotten to bed like I did and thought, wow, I didn't even leave home, but I am completely exhausted. That's what sprinting and marathoning will do. And it was lonely. It was really lonely. We were cut off instantaneously almost, losing our norms. And just when we got some sort of awareness about what was going on, the racial equity reawakening and awareness came on. And that was discombobulating, and that was upsetting. And that really interacted with, of course, COVID. You know, I remember my son went to Boston and he went to protest. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm not really ready to do that. So I was protesting at the end of my street. I live near Mass Ave. So this really was interacting quite a bit. And there were lots of changes in behavior that we saw in ourselves, that we saw in others. And on the other side of the screen, you can see it says physically distanced. You know the term social distancing. I completely reject that. We need the social desperately, but we have to physically distance. So I use that term physical distancing because that's really much more accurate for what I believe we need to be doing. And of course, quarantining. Oh, we saw that in the movies, all right, but we never had to do it. And quarantining was fun for a day. I did clean one closet. I planned on cleaning all my closets. I don't know why I never got to it, because quarantining had a profound effect on us that we hadn't anticipated. We're shifting our lives and shifting our expectations and learning new ways to connect. Oh, it was really fun to be on Zoom in the beginning. Let's be honest, Zoom is not that much fun, and it is exhausting. Like, we don't want to do it anymore. I have friends, we Zoom every Saturday, and 2 Saturdays ago, I said, I cannot Zoom. I cannot be on any more Zoom meetings. Zoom fatigue. And of course, for teachers or anyone in any kind of teaching capacity, that's everyone who's on here, you thought you were remotely or virtually doing that. You weren't. It's the one thing I will tell you we're not doing. You are pandemically teaching or pandemically learning. And what I mean is this. Virtual and remote means it was practice. It was anticipated. We knew it was coming. We felt comfortable with it. Pandemic means we had a pivot at a moment's notice. We didn't understand that technology or use it that much under this incredible stressor of COVID-19. That is why teachers burned out. That is why police, first responders, human service people, community people burned out. It was exhausting for all of us. That's what pandemic teaching and learning is all about. And you see at the bottom is a quote from Dr. Fauci. I love Dr. Fauci. I am a nerd fan of his. I don't know if you saw early in the pandemic, they asked him if someone were to play you in the movies or TV, who would it be? And without missing a beat, he said Brad Pitt. And on Saturday Night Live, there was Brad Pitt playing Dr. Fauci. And I'm such a nerd. I saw his, I looked online, his birthday's in December. I'm thinking about a gift already, but this is someone who I really respect and someone who I follow and someone who really is making a lot of sense to me right now in a time when things don't make a lot of sense. And of course, you know, we're learning a lot. Our mental health issues are serious. So for example, if you know someone between the age of 18 and 24, perhaps someone on here is in that age group, we know from a new survey that 25% of that age group has seriously considered suicide during COVID. 25%, 1 in 4. That's just astounding. And several months ago, there was a survey, a national survey that said 88,000 people who did not identify as having anxiety or depression now identify in that way. I think that number is certainly higher because that was a couple months ago. And the June report of the CDC said that 31% of Americans have anxiety, 26% trauma, and 11% have seriously considered suicide. So we know that it's impacted us a lot. We also know that from past tragedies that impacts mental health. So for example, in Puerto Rico, we know that the hurricanes of a few years ago, after that, rates of drinking, drugging, self-harm, anxiety, and suicide increased. We also know in 2008, the last financial crunch, and we're into a financial crunch now, and that will be probably ongoing. We know in 2008, there were 10,000 documented cases of suicide just directly related to that. So it's important to talk about that. And I know that Jacqueline Abser wrote in, this is the fun part, and Dan wrote in, you know, John's middle name, his nickname is Fun. To me, I'll tell you what fun is. Fun is learning about this stuff. Fun is knowing how to respond in certain ways. It gives me a lot of peace of mind. And there will be fun parts. Hopefully the crunching the paper was one of the fun parts. But my definition of fun is let's learn some information. And of course, this has impacted people very differently. We know that young people have been highly impacted. They have very reactive brains. We know that they're involving themselves in risk-taking behavior. They see risk, but they're more drawn to the reward. And we've seen that in several communities where there were big parties, and you know, in the Lincoln Sudbury area in Dedham, where kids got together for big parties. Oh, they see the risk. They're very smart, but they're more drawn to the social reward, and being cut off from their friends has been devastating. And this has been hard for lots of groups. So if you're gay, lesbian, transgendered, you've been cut off from your traditional areas of support. Maybe home is not as supportive as it has been in the past. Anyone with any kind of disability or special needs, this has been hard. Someone who has an eating disorder, this has been particularly hard, getting your safe foods, you know, those sort of things. And we know from a very, very recent survey that Google did that never in the history of Google have they had more searches for the words pandemic, a panic, or panic attack, or anxiety attack than they have in the last 6 months. Not a surprise, but these are really things that we have to understand are very real. And we know people who have any kind of pre-existing conditions, maybe they have an anxiety condition, depression. We know that this has exacerbated this, and we know that people have started on these behaviors and these mental health challenges, again, because they haven't had them in the past. So I want to talk a little bit about all the people who are on here. Hopefully I've covered everyone here. You know, teachers and essential workers were really seen as heroes and making a difference and being so important. And that was lovely. That was long overdue. And of course, there's this whole debate about essential workers and all the politics. We're not getting into that. When I hear about essential workers, that strikes a bell with me with teachers, with police, fire, the people in the community who are doing all that you're doing. This is really great. And you've worked so incredibly hard, so selflessly. It has been really amazing and impressive. You know, recreating how to connect with your communities, planning, mostly worrying about things. I know a lot of people had no summer, particularly people in education and other places, because they were just trying to figure out how we can go on during this time. But you know, all these heroes and all these people who are essential workers are people too. And you have all sorts of issues that everyone else has. You know, relationship issues, family issues, financial issues, mental health issues. And that is why, again, a lot of people burned out, particularly in May and June, and that pandemic teaching. And this is really my focus today, to look about the mental health and emotional issues for you. I do a lot of these trainings, and my wife said to me, "Is it depressing doing these trainings?" I said, "No, this is exciting. It's exciting because I think people want to talk about it. I think people want to learn about this." And of course, you know, we're all carrying around a lot of emotion, a lot of feelings, and this suitcase represents it. You can already tell if you don't know my work. I use a lot of visual models in my work. This is the visual model of the suitcase that we're carrying around, and we were pretty good about carrying it around. We handled it really well with all of these feelings. It was really amazing what we did. But you know what? Carry something around for long enough, it feels heavy. It feels exhausting, that sort of thing. And we've all gone through this grief and loss process. And here's the kind of visual model of it, but I want to talk about it in this next slide here. And of course, this is a stage that most people go through. And the first one is denial. And denial is an important stage. It acts like a buffer, because if we had to assimilate all the difficult truths all at once, it would literally knock us over. And denial kind of sounds like this. This can't be true. This can't be happening. That's what it sounds like. The next stage for a lot of people is anger. I know I have felt that too. Who could you be angry at? You could be angry at a local leader. You could be angry at a state leader. You could be angry at God. If there was a God, how could God allow this to happen? You could be angry at your town manager if you work for a town. If you work within a schools, you could be angry at your superintendent. And if you're a mom and dad and you're on here, your kids would probably be angry at you quite a bit. And the next stage for a lot of us is guilt. I know I felt that way. I felt guilty. I wasn't contributing enough. And I read an article which was so helpful to me. And it said, if you're staying home and you're being safe, that is an important contribution. It made me feel a lot better about my guilt. The next stage is depression. That heavy feeling, that sad feeling, that overwhelming feeling. I know I've experienced that. And the last stage is acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean you like what's going on anymore. It just means you're accepting where we're at. Now, at any point, you can go back to a previous stage. I certainly have cycled back to anger many times. I've cycled back to depression many times. This is called normal. But it's important to intellectualize the process and to understand it for yourself, identify where you're at, letting other people know where you're at. And if you're in a teaching mode with your own kids, with people in your office, with your community, please share this, because not everyone really is familiar with the grieving loss process. And this, you might remember Abraham Maslow. This is from the 40s, 1943, his hierarchy of needs. Most of us learned this in high school. Okay, I was sleeping during this part, but I got it in college and graduate school, so I had enough. And, we were kind of knocked down to the bottom about, our physiological needs. And this is something that was hard for us, just around safety and about, getting food and those sort of things. This was really, really difficult for us. But we're going to be going up on this. And again, to intellectualize the process is an important thing to do. So let's talk a little bit for our young people. So many of us work with young people, and talk about like where they're at and what they're dealing with. So this is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Many of you are familiar with this, but I have to say something about this. This is BC, before Corona. And these numbers are what they are, but they will, I don't know, double possibly as we go forward, because this is impacting people so much. And we're going to be breaking this down, but these numbers are really intimidating when you look at it. The numbers in parentheses are the factored out numbers. So if you take 7.5% of 1,200 students in a typical high school, you have 90 students. You're probably going to have to check my math. None of us human service people are too good at math, except for Dan. He's the treasurer, so he understands math, hopefully. But these numbers are really intimidating in the sense that they're really high. And again, they are BC, before Corona, and we really have to understand that. But the next slide is about us people who are not young anymore, and looking at people who are impacted. I already told you about the fact that 25% of people between the age of 18 and 24 have thought about suicide during COVID. Now they're saying, the latest things they're saying is that 40% of adults right now are struggling with a mental health issue. 40%. Can you imagine if I told you 40% of adults had any kind of challenge? That would be a national priority. That would be something we'd be attending to. And we know that 31% now are saying during COVID that they have anxiety. You see 19% on there as an anxiety disorder diagnosed, but 31%. And this has been really incredibly traumatic. And in our culture, we are so good with physical things. Can you imagine if you broke your leg and you waited 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, or never to get help? That's what we do around these sort of mental health challenges. We're so good from the neck down, physical. The neck up, of course, we're not as good. There's stigma. There are barriers to getting help, but we need to get better. And I think some of that is changing for the better. And we've all heard this term, surge before. That we used to think of that like a physical surge. I think about the mental health surge around all of these issues, because these issues are not just important, they are going to be in our lives. For the young people we know, for the people we live with, for the people we work with, these are going to be very real. So it's really important to talk about that. And some people think, well, it's kind of a downer to talk about these things. When we, from my point of view, when we understand about suicide, when we understand about self-harm, we're going to be spending time about anxiety. To me, that's a helpful thing. And I'm hoping you feel the same way. And, when we're not feeling right, we tend to gravitate towards something that's going to make us feel better, to decrease our discomfort. And some of those things are very easy and available, but they're hollow and they're actually hurtful. Self-injury and suicide at the bottom of that list, or substance use, drinking, drugging, that sort of thing, or disordered eating. And people gravitate toward this again because it's easier to do. It's harder to really understand about the more healthy ways to do things. And that's kind of why we're here today. And I want to talk about some of these healthier ways. I'm also looking at the clock. And the first thing I want to talk about is self-harm. Self-harm, cutting, burning, ingesting. People who self-harm for a good reason to them. It makes sense to them. Now, maybe about 10% of their brain knows there are better ways to handle it, but it makes sense to them. It's a very addictive sort of behavior. And they tell us that they feel pain, which is better than nothing. They feel a measure of optimism, a measure of control. There is some overlap with suicide. So we know that people who are suicidal, a high percentage of them have self-harmed. But just because you self-harm, it doesn't mean you'll be suicidal. And it's really about emotional regulation. So self-harm is associated with younger people, and that's very true. But we also know that self-harm, it really impacts all age groups. And we know in the past, people would hide their cuts. They were ashamed about it. But now actually people are showing it more. They're expressing it more, and they're telling us really that what's going on the inside is now visible on the outside. And again, it's not just young people. And that could be, pulling of your hair, picking at scabs, that sort of thing. Self-harm is defined a little bit more broadly these days. And I want to talk about suicide. I do a lot of work in suicide prevention all the time. And I really think that we need to spend a lot of time on this because of that statistic of 1 in 4 young people who are seriously considered suicide during COVID. So this is really important. I want to start out by talking about romaine lettuce. Why would I be talking about romaine lettuce? I want to tell you why. Remember about 2 years ago, the CDC said, don't have romaine lettuce, throw it out, clean your refrigerator, because if you did, you might get E. coli. I remember that time. I remember throwing out romaine in my refrigerator. My wife and I were cleaning our refrigerator, which was amazing. We hadn't cleaned it in a decade. I said, damn, that CDC is powerful. They got me to clean my refrigerator. Well, every life is important. You might not know this, but less than 100 die of E. coli. Less than 100, every life is important. Now imagine you're in Fenway Park, which is hard to do because there is baseball, but not in Fenway Park. It's pretty empty. But imagine you're there last season when they were better, or 3 seasons ago. And imagine looking to your left and looking to your right, looking in the dugout, looking at everyone in that stadium. Now let's add 8,000 people for over 45,000 people. That's the number of people that die by suicide every year in this country. Wow. Let's go back to my prior example. The CDC came out with a very strong message about romaine lettuce. You couldn't get romaine lettuce anywhere. You couldn't get a Caesar salad in any restaurant. You couldn't find it. Less than 100 die. Every life is important. When's the last time the CDC came out with an alert around suicide? The answer is never. But I'm giving you the alert. This is so important. And if someone broke into your home, you would dial 911. Of course, we all know that number. But very shortly, if you dial 988, that's going to be the suicide emergency number. And typically in Massachusetts, if you're between the age of 45 and 54, that covers probably a lot of people here, those for men and women register the highest number of completed suicides. We want to use proper terms like completed suicide, not successful suicide. We don't even say committed suicide anymore. That's like committed a crime, committed a felony. We don't say that anymore. And we also know that for men and women, it's very different. So we know that boys and men have higher rates of completed suicide, but we know that women and girls actually attempt suicide 3 to 4 times as frequently. The reason for the high completion rate for boys and men is that they are using lethal weapons like guns. In fact, Massachusetts has one of the lowest completion rates for suicide in the country because we have pretty rigid gun control laws. Just to the north of us in Vermont, very close to us, it's twice the rate because Vermont has more lax gun control laws. So wherever you are around these sort of issues, it's really important to understand about guns, that guns and suicide correlate very highly, and we have to understand about that. And there are a lot of myths and facts about suicide, you know, like, oh my goodness, the worst time that happens is the holidays. Well, the worst time for suicide in terms of completed suicide used to be the spring and the summer. I want to tell you some of the leading thinking about that. You know, you might have allergies and your immune system is compromised physically around that time of the year, the spring and the summer. Now we're thinking perhaps, you know, more than just our physical health, but our mental health is compromised then. But I also have to tell you that COVID has knocked everything off the map. So for example, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. I always say when I speak, next year it'll be 9 or 8. Actually, next year it'll probably be 11 because COVID is now going to be number 3 on that list. So a lot of things are changing. The myths and facts are important to know, but the holidays are one of the safest times for sure. And I want to...
John, can you just, there's a quick question that maybe you can answer quickly, just if you can underscore the proper term to use regarding suicide. Somebody just has to clarify, make sure they're getting
so we
it
don't
right.
use, so some terms we don't use anymore, like committed suicide. You know, we say died by suicide. We don't say successful suicide. It's not a success. We say completed suicide. And I'll be honest with you, when I see this in the paper, I've seen it in the sport page about 5 times in the last 5 months. I've written to every one of those writers just saying, these are the terms we use. 4 of the 5 writers got back to me apologizing. I said, no need to apologize. We're all learning about this. So using proper terms is really important to do. And I want to just share a couple things on the bottom. It says the mantra. And many of you know this. I do a lot of trainings in this. One of the mantras about suicide is, it's not that people want to die. It's that they can't figure out a way to go on living. And that's so important to know. And it says the 3 most important words. And I want to tell you what I mean by that. And I want to use my son, Jake, as an example. By the way, I tell lots of stories about my wife, my kids. They all know about it. They're all comfortable with it. I didn't want anyone to think I'm telling stories about them. But my son, Jake, really struggled with anxiety and depression. And of course, all of that is related to suicide. And the struggle was really overwhelming for him. And he came home from school one day, actually after basketball practice, and he looked at me and he said, you know, Dad, I just want to die. I can't take this anymore. I want to kill myself. And I want to tell you about that moment because it was something I'll never forget. The very first thing that happened is I started to cry. If that's ever said to you by someone that you care about, someone you're working with, and you start to cry, that's called being human. The next thing I did is I said, thank you, Jake. I wanted to acknowledge it. I wanted him to know that I heard it because that was the hardest thing he has ever said to me. Kids, or maybe your clients or people you work with, people don't like to disappoint other people. By telling me that he was going to disappoint me, that was incredibly hard to do. By saying thank you, that acknowledged it was so important. After that, had I not done this for a living, I probably would have said like, Jake, you don't mean that. Or Jake, things will get better. Or things like that, well-intentioned. What we say as moms and dads, as police, as teachers, as community workers, as clinicians, all well-intentioned. But there are better things to say. And I want to tell you the 3 words I said to Jake. I said, tell me more. He said, what the hell do you mean, Dad, tell you more? I don't know, Jake, you just told me you wanted to end your life. Tell me more. That opened up conversation. We want to open up conversation around suicide. You know, we also have to know around suicide what to do and what not to do. So for example, when I was in graduate school, to show you how old I am, they said, don't talk about suicide. You're going to plant the seed. Can you imagine someone's having a good day and you start talking about suicide and they're not suicidal, but they say, wow, I hadn't thought about that. I think I'll try that. No, that's not going to happen. Then they said to us, well, you know, years later, have them sign a contract that they won't kill themselves. That works great for about 12 seconds. It doesn't work beyond that. Here is a better thing to say if you're worried about anyone in your life, to say this: if you felt at risk, tell me 3 things you would do to keep yourself alive. I would tell you, I would tell my coach, I would call a hotline. Those sort of things are much more predictive of safety. Of course, nothing is a guarantee than signing a contract, that sort of thing. So I'm going to get off suicide because literally I will talk for 2 hours about it. But the reason we're talking about it is this: we know that it's increasing. We know it's already over 45,000 people. So please be good to yourself. Understand the things to say to people who are at risk around you. And of course, one of the things that's increased the most is anxiety. By the way, I want to tell you about 6 or 8 months ago, my wife, well, it was actually before the pandemic, I was actually going out speaking live. And my wife says, what are you speaking about tonight? Which is an unusual question because you usually ask where I'm speaking. So I said, you mean where I'm speaking? She said, no, what's your topic? I said, oh, you don't really ask. And I said, I'm actually talking about anxiety. And she said, really? And I said, yeah, why do you ask? She says, you're an expert in anxiety. I said, really? I don't consider myself an expert in practically anything in life. Like, why do you say that? She says, because you make me anxious all the damn time. You're an expert in that. So I'm an expert in anxiety, according to my wife, and I'm also an anxious person. So I relate to this very directly. And I want to talk about anxiety. And the couple of things I want to say right off the bat is that anxiety is powerful. And anxiety lies to us. Anxiety tells us that things are never going to get better. And just like that crunched up piece of paper, it makes our world small. And when anxiety is out of control and competes with almost anything else, it almost always wins. Good example about my son, Jake, again, excellent basketball player. That's how he got to the starting lineup at Belmont High School, because in practice, he was great. But on Tuesday and Friday nights, when the lights went on and the crowd was there, his anxiety was competing with his behavior as a good basketball player. My wife and I would sit in the stands and she would say, what the heck happened to Jake? He's terrible out there. Yes, that was his anxiety speaking. And when we're not achieving in a certain way in our jobs, in what we do, in our lives, oftentimes it's anxiety. It's very crippling. It's not that we won't do something. We can't. We don't have the capacity. Anxiety saps our capacity. I want to talk about a couple of these anxieties: OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. We think about that, the obsession to think about it and the compulsion to do it. We think about people who wash their hands a lot. But hey, it's certainly changed during COVID. We should be washing our hands a lot. We know that people who have OCD have been triggered. We know that people who never had OCD, particularly young people with a highly reactive brains, are starting that behavior, and that's really frightening. And we know that panic attacks have increased. There are already some studies about that. And I want to tell you about a panic attack that my wife had about a year and a half ago at this point. Again, if you join late, I tell stories about my wife and kids. They all know about it. This happened at 5:28 in the morning. She popped out of bed. She said, I'm having a heart attack. We have to go to Mount Auburn Hospital. And even though I adore my wife, I completely abandoned her. I ran downstairs to the kitchen. I know I sound like the worst partner around, but I had a plan. And I grabbed some ice cubes and I ran upstairs and I said, hold these ice cubes. And I so wish I had a camera, because what happened over the next 15 or 20 minutes was both shocking and funny at the same time. The very first thing she said to me was, I hate living with a therapist. Oh, I'd heard that many times from my kids. I hadn't heard that from my wife. And I said, just hold the damn ice cubes. So she was holding the ice cubes. And after about 5 minutes, she said to me, my hands are freezing. I could see her anxiety, her panic going down. And I said, no, just hold on to the ice cubes. And about 4 or 5 minutes later, she says, no, my hands are freezing. You really can't be in a panic mode for more than 20 or 25 minutes. Our bodies literally can't take it. So this is about 10 minutes in. I said, well, you seem like things are a little bit better. We were talking more freely. I said, you don't need to hold the ice cubes. And this is where I wish I had the camera. She literally threw them at me. It would have made such a great video. Well, panic attacks are not things that we schedule. They happen. They're very embarrassing for people. If you haven't had one, you may have observed one. And I had one the other week when I had my computer problems. I literally was really in a panic situation because I was just so overwhelmed by that. And fortunately, it only lasts about 15 or 20 minutes because that's all we can take. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that it's very real. We know that some people, after COVID is over, and that's not going to be tomorrow, we all know that, will go back to their way of life and not really suffer any PTSD. We know that some people will deal with it for a short period of time, but we know that some people, this will be a lifelong challenge. There is no timeline for some people around PTSD. And it doesn't take a lot to trigger it: a sight, a sound, a word. So we really have to understand that this is very real for a lot of people. And here are some of the emotional signs of anxiety. None of this will surprise you. My wife really thought she was having a heart attack. And when we have anxiety, sometimes there are productive anxieties and productive worries. It's not all bad. So the productive ones are ones that solve issues, the ones that result in a good decision. Those are really productive ones. Most of mine are unproductive, where I'm spiraling around anxiety and just creating some more anxiety for myself. And here are some of the emotional signs. Again, none of this will surprise you. Maybe you've experienced this yourself. And I always think of anxiety like an iceberg. And I want to talk a little bit about what my anxiety looks like. When I am anxious, I overplan. It drives everyone in my life nuts. I want to write a couple notes. When are we going to do this? How are we going to fix this? What's going to happen? I overplan. That's just what I do. When my son Jake is anxious, he is rude. He's defiant. He's not a really rude or defiant kid at all. In fact, he's a lovely person, but that's what his anxiety, how it shows itself. So this visual model, again, the visual models that I work with really illustrate the fact that we see that behavior on the surface. And some of these behaviors are annoying. Let's be honest. We'd rather not deal with these sort of things, the negativity, the anger, those sort of things. But we need to intellectualize it and really look what's going on below the surface, because below the surface, there's a lot going on, and we really need to be cognizant of that and attentive to that too. And of course, we're dealing with a lot of return anxiety. And someone told me very early on in COVID, this is like 9/11. This is nothing like 9/11. In 9/11, we could get together. We could literally hold each other, congregate, that sort of thing. This is completely different. And our protective factors are not as within our reach as they were. And we don't really know what our new world will be like. Of course, some districts are back full-time, some are back part-time, some are remote, but we don't know what it's going to be like to be back at work, at school. We don't know these things. And this is particularly hard, this return anxiety. And my sister told me recently, she told me this last week, that her dog Bailey's having a hard time because she's returned to work. So if you have an animal at home, they're having a hard time. I don't know anyone who has been spared or anything has been spared during this time. And of course, we could spend a lot of time thinking about what we can't control. Oh, that is an endless list. I have a neighbor, never wears a mask, drives me crazy. Maybe someone at work is not washing their hands enough, is not opening up the window enough, or not wearing a mask enough. Or, one of my pet peeves is someone wearing a mask, but their nose is uncovered. So we can focus in on all those things that we can't control. But if we focus in on the things we can control, that is going to help our anxiety a lot. Because I feel a lot better when I am safe, when I'm doing the things that I need to do and the things that are keeping me safe. I'm not so okay when I'm focusing in on what others are not doing. So thinking about what we can control is so important. And of course, to ourselves and to other people, we have to say things that are helpful. So for example, if we're in a live group, I'd be saying this, but I'll just do all the work myself. You relax. We'll do this with you a little bit later in terms of participation. Some of the worst things that we can say to people who are anxious are, don't worry about it. Get over it. It's not a big deal. Or my favorite, it's all in your head. Well, of course it's all in your head. This is what anxiety is. But it's hard to know the best thing to say. And as an anxious person, I live it. My son dealt with anxiety. I didn't always say the right things. And I want to share with you some of the things that are helpful. Telling me more is what we said around suicide, but it's also around anxiety too. And I want to tell you a story about my son, Jake, again. I know he's getting a lot of the stories today. I have to throw in a story about my daughter, Jessie. When he was dealing with his anxiety and his depression, he didn't want to talk to me. I get it. I'm his dad. I'm a therapist. Who the heck wants to talk? And finally I said, Jake, every day I want you to scale it. And 10 being the worst, 1 being the best. So on a Monday, he was like a 3, pretty good. On a Tuesday, he was like a 7, not quite as good. And I could say to him, what would have to happen for you to become a 3 again? That sort of thing. Every day I got a scale number from him, and that was so important. It changed my whole parenting. You can do this with your colleagues, and now I do it with my wife. When I am having a really anxious day, I will tell her my number. Don't have to have a discussion. Interestingly enough, with my son, I knew there was a pattern. I just didn't know what the pattern was. And I wrote down on a calendar, unbeknownst to him, the number he gave me every day. This is pre-COVID. Not surprisingly, his most anxious day of the week was Sunday. Thinking about academic challenges ahead for the week, social challenges, athletic challenges. It changed my whole parenting on Sunday. I never asked about homework. I never asked about chores. Every Sunday we had his favorite meal. My daughter Jessie picked up on it after a couple of weeks. She says, why the hell does Jake get his favorite meal every Sunday? I said, quiet, Jessie, he needs this. And he really did. So you can let people know around anxiety. It's not you have it or you don't. We need to understand the gradations about it, and scaling it is a wonderful way. So if you're a teacher, this is really great to use. If there's someone in your life, personal life, your professional life, this is also a great thing to use. It doesn't require a lot of discussion, just a number. And you might want to write it down on a calendar to see how things emerge. So there are other things we can do to help recalibrate our brain. I did that with my wife with the ice cubes. And one of the things I neglected to say is when I was going through my panic around my computer, I literally did the ice cube thing for myself. Like I know what it's all about. And I went and I grabbed ice cubes and damn, your hands do get cold. But another way to recalibrate the brain, like I was doing with the ice cubes, is name 3 things: something you hear, something you see, something, something like that. Again, to recalibrate the brain is really important. So this next slide was my most difficult slide of this entire presentation to put together. And I want to tell you why. Because I've got a lot to say around anxiety, and I figured I got to get it on one slide, and I just said the top 10 things. So what I want to say about anxiety is if you are an anxious person, you'll probably always have anxiety. That's okay. It's about learning to live with the anxiety. Some of the best programs happening anywhere around youth and anxiety are not working with kids themselves. It's working with their parents so we can be responding in much more healthy ways. And of course, anxiety is very different for everyone, and we don't want to avoid talking about it. My wife's example, it is with the ice cubes. I didn't want to avoid talking about it. I needed to recalibrate her brain so we could talk about it. And you can see the last bullet point here about debriefing. So it happened at 5:28 in the morning. I told you her panic attack lasted about 20 minutes or so. When we were going to sleep at night, a good 15 hours or 17 hours later, I said to my wife, you know what, we really need to talk about this and debrief so I can be more helpful. I'm going to be really honest with you. She groaned like, oh, I don't want to revisit that. But it was a really important discussion. And it's important that you let people know who are around you what would be helpful to you. Because so often we get things said and done to us which are not helpful. So we have to understand that. We also have to use distractions. Distractions, again, like the ice cubes, not to avoid talking about it, but just to get us away a little bit. My distraction is shooting hoops. When I do that, I feel a lot better. So it's important to know. And of course, on this slide is seeking professional help, knowing when you need help. And I want to tell you some of the things you're really good at. Here is the list of stuff you're really good at. Yeah, you're helpful. This is why you do what you do. You're just incredibly helpful. You're very generous with your time, with your thought. You're really incredible about that stuff. And I really want to support that. I want you to know how impressive it is and how amazing it is. Like, don't change in that regard. But I want to tell you something you really are bad at. You really are bad at self-care. And I can tell you that a lot of people who do what everyone on this webinar is all about, they're just not so good at self-care. You know, they're thinking about others. And you are maybe the captain of the ship in your house. Maybe you are in your office, the director or an important person. But whoever you are, like, you've got to care about yourself. And I want to talk about self-care. The first time I heard about self-care years ago, truthfully, I laughed about it. I don't know, it was 20 years ago. Like, self-care just seemed wrong. It seemed very selfish, you know? And I've learned a lot, of course, as we have over the years. I've been in situations where I did really poorly around self-care. When I was a youth director in Needham, we had many completed suicides of young people in a short period of time. My self-care was not very good, and I suffered greatly from that. I wish I had done a better job there because, you know, I thought a lot of times around self-care, I thought, well, it's just selfish. You know, it's just another thing I have to do. No, self-care is something that shouldn't be a reward. Self-care is something that we have to do consistently. It has to be something that's intentional, and it relieves the burden. You know, it really does. And I wish I had done a better job during that time. One of the things I did do for myself is use music as one of my self-cares, but I really didn't do such a good job. And right now we're in the middle of a trauma, a crisis, which has lasted 6 months and is going to last for a long time. We know that. So self-care has to be part what you do. And I do a very similar webinar to this for parents, and I'm always talking about self-care. And when I do it for teachers, I really hammer home the point that teachers have to do it too. And I want to talk about building your self-care toolbox. You know, you guys probably teach this to other people a lot, but you're not so good at doing it, you know? And we have to build our toolbox quite a bit. Less tech, particularly if that tech is not bringing you any kind of enjoyment. Saying no, you know, is so important, but you can't feel guilty when you say no. And also, you can't be working all the time. I have a friend who's a teacher. She was literally working 20 hours a day. It was ridiculous. And I called her one night at 10:30 and I said, I'm just calling to see if you're working. And she said, you know, you'd be very proud of me, John, I'm not working. I said, that's great, because you've got to stop working. I said, what are you doing? She said, I'm on Pinterest. I said, that's great. What are you doing on Pinterest? She says, I'm looking for things for my classroom. I said, well, wait a second, that's working. So we really have to have moments of quiet and stillness, listening to our internal voices, and making self-care something that we do consistently, not as a reward, not as a treat, but something we're doing consistently. And here's what self-care might look like. I like the laughing and humor. That's important. I don't know if you saw the quote from Adam Sandler. My favorite quote during the pandemic about education was, he said, the American educational system wasn't built with the idea that I'd be teaching math to my kids. You know, laughter is really important. Go on YouTube and just type in sometime laughing circles. You'll see people in a circle laughing. Oh, it looks kind of weird at first. It's not very genuine, but after a while, people keep laughing and laughing. It is very genuine, of course. And healthy eating is on that list. And that may seem simple, but I want to tell you something. Healthy eating is important. And let's talk about the drinking also. We know in Massachusetts, rates of alcohol sales have skyrocketed. Now, perhaps people just want the alcohol and they're storing it in their basement. They're not drinking, but I think not. I think people are drinking more. You're not going to the office. You're not driving, that sort of thing. So let's be careful about our drinking too. And let's understand what our self-care looks like in helpful ways and sometimes not in helpful ways. And that changes. For example, for me, when I'm exercising, sometimes that is the worst thing for my self-care because my mind is going a mile a minute. The music that I am listening to, the movie that I'm watching, I just can't focus in on that. So when that happens for me, I stop exercising. That's not good for me then. So having a self-care activity is really important. It's also important to have an activity that's doable, that's achievable, that's a beginning, middle, and end. When I really am attentive to my self-care, one of the first things I do is make my bed in the morning. My mom, who's not alive anymore, if she were alive, she'd be hysterical because I never made my bed my entire life. But it has a beginning, middle, and end, and that's very important. You know, the other thing that I've done during my self-care is really work on giving up perfectionism. If you're perfectionistic, it's really hard to feel good. People who are perfectionistic tend not to live in the moment. They tend to perseverate around that perfectionism, and it's really hard to attend to things like self-care and liking yourself. So self-care is different for everyone, of course. And what I'm going to ask you to do, I will do it in a second here. Sorry about that. So here, of course, we're not going to do a mindfulness activity, but mindfulness is really important. The very first time I had to do a mindfulness thing, I thought, this is just ridiculous. Of course, I know how to breathe. I can do this guided imagery stuff, but I have to tell you, if you've done it, and I have a suspicion that everyone on here has done that sort of thing, you know that it calms your body, your heart rate decreases. It can be very centering. It can be a very soulful experience. So, you know, teaching that to ourselves, teaching that to our kids is really important. And I thought I would share this morning some of my self-care. Again, these are accomplishable tasks, giving up perfection. And I want to tell you what these are because they have some relevance. So we have a cabin in Western Mass near Northampton, good for my mental health. And this table on the right-hand side is concrete. I dumped in a bucket with a little bit of water and I stuck 3 dowels in there. And then I had something I could have outside that could weather any storm. But if you look very closely at this, you can see on the right-hand side that the concrete part is a little bit narrower than on the left-hand side. It's a little thicker. And that's because my shed has a very steep incline. It's about ready to fall over. This is about giving up my perfectionism. My self-care is about doing things that are accomplishable, things that are tangible, and giving up perfectionism. When my wife came out and saw that, she felt the top. It's very smooth because I dumped the stuff into a Home Depot bucket, very smooth. She said, that's amazing. And then she looked at it, just, but you know, it's not evil. It's not level. I said, oh, the top is level, but it's not level down below. Drove her crazy. Her perfectionism just didn't allow her to go there. I don't even see it anymore. I just see that it's a great table I can leave outside. And on the left-hand side is I needed a light for my cabin, and I had seen this many years before. And I took chicken wire, which I already had, and just put it into a circle, dropped in like an Edison bulb. I had this really cool light. My self-care is about creating things. And what I want you to do is now I'm going to push what your self-care is like. And I'm going to go to the chat. And I'm going to ask you if you will type in right now. I don't know why I can't see it. Hold on, I'm trying to get the chat. Your self-care, the things that you do for your self-care. So if you can do that now, that would be great. Things that you do for your self-care, spending time in nature. That's so important to do. Actually, contacting the earth is so important. When I have to do self-care, one of the things I really do is I garden without gloves. Now, okay, my hands look disgusting. My nails, it takes like a week to get going, but contacting the earth is a very important thing in terms of my own anxiety and self-care. Meditation, walking alone, walks on the beach, you know, hiking. I'm hearing a lot of things out in nature. But cooking, knowing your self-care is really an important thing to do. But you also have to practice it. We have to have self-care things. Yoga is on that list. Self-care things which are achievable, which are doable, which we can replicate in a lot of different ways. So this is great. I see gardening on there. I'm not much of a gardener, but I like being outside, listening to the trees and the birds. Yeah, these are important self-care things. And I'm going to ask you to do this now. Moments of stillness and quietness. I'm going to ask you to take like 20 seconds. We'll do it in a second. And then I'm going to ask you to, I'll let you know, to put into the chat what you hear. So ready? Go. Okay, it probably wasn't 20 seconds. So I'll tell you what I heard. I heard my neighbor's always doing his lawn like 24/7. Tell me what you're hearing. A computer fan, a bird, you know, those sort of things. The clock ticking. Yes, my breath. So again, you know, this is part of our self-care, centering ourselves in the moment. That's really important. So I want to tell you what the last, say, half hour of this webinar is going to be like. What we want to do is to have as interactive a time as possible. I know David and maybe Dan and Randy are going to maybe help me a little bit. We're going to have some group discussion, which is really hard to do. We know that COVID has impacted us in every which way, physically, logistically, mental health. And we thought we would use kind of the power of the group for people to write in, and David and Dan and Randy can help me because we're going to talk about it too. To help us monitor the chat and just write in what's happening in your life, in your community around these things, particularly around mental health, that might be valuable for other communities to know about, for other people to know about, because this has been such a challenging time. And one of my mantras around this time is it's okay not to be okay, because this has been so overwhelming. And this hasn't been like a short term or just simple trauma. It has been a long-term trauma. We know that stress does not cause, say, suicide, for example, but we know that long-term stress can. So type in what is happening, you know, in your school or your community, particularly around mental health. That would be really valuable for other people to know. We have no idea if people can and will participate in this, but we're hoping you will. So I'm seeing about the NAMI support groups and mental health classes. This is really important to know. It's important to know for you. It's important to pass those on. If I were a classroom teacher, I'd be having, you know, 800 numbers and stuff from NAMI and other organizations posted or sent to kids or sent to parents. So I'm saying in Winchester, trying to connect volunteers with people who need help, such as grocery shopping. Yeah, we all need help. And this is so important to do. In fact, when we're helping other people, it makes us feel better about our lives. That's really important to do. What else is happening in your community, in your town, on the town side, on the school side, what you're doing in your home that might be helpful and valuable that we can talk about here? So I know a lot of communities, like for one district, I'm working with teachers, giving teachers support. It's very separate. This isn't about reporting back. just giving teachers support because it's been really hard for teachers. I really believe that that school superintendents, principals, leadership, they are giving out and they need a support group. And I'm not trying to sell my services at all. I'm just saying that is a group that worked hard all summer. And as one assistant principal said to me, we're working so hard, we don't even know if all the things we're putting in place are going to work. So I see in Woburn, you started a new parent network, which is really great. Yeah, so trying to give out some statistics around public health. This is really important. We all want information, and good information is really important for people's mental health. Of course, some of these numbers and some of these statistics are hard to hear, but it's really important that everyone be respected and being given good information. And of course, populations need things in different ways. For our young people, what they need is really different than our senior citizens. And that's important to know. I know there are some programs that you have funding coming up to look at seniors. This has been particularly isolating for seniors. And then, of course, getting them to interact safely is a challenge too. What other things are you doing in your community? Yeah, so I like what Burlington Youth and Family is doing, the 1 hour consultation. Yeah, so this is really great. People really sometimes don't want to go into therapy for years and years and years. So offering a 1 hour consultation is really great and very centering for people. What else are people doing here? Support group for new moms. Yeah, this has been really hard. My daughter had her first baby. It's our first grandchild 6 weeks ago. You know, she didn't really have the opportunity to walk down the street and people say, what do you do? And of course, when the baby came home, we were all in masks. I had to wait 2 weeks to hold my grandson. I texted my grandson. He doesn't have a text. I sent it to my daughter. I said, share this with Milo, my new grandson. And it was this. I said, Milo, if when I hold you for the first time, you're crying, that's okay, because I'll be crying too. So it's hard for these new moms. It's hard for families who want to give. And this really differentiates this so much from 9/11. This has really been hard. So groups for new moms. I know my daughter, as much as now we're in her pod, but as much as that's happening, this has been very isolating for new moms and very overwhelming. It's hard enough to be a new parent, let alone having these on top. Support groups for single mothers and survivors of domestic violence. This is important. We know that people who are victimized and DV victims, this has actually been a hard time. Perhaps they're quarantined with the person who are victimizing them. So this is so important to do. And finding safe ways to bring the community together, being inventive, you know, being clever. I'll give you a good example. So my daughter told me that a friend of hers wanted to see her grandmother who was very sick, but wanted to be safe. And literally, she ordered online a shower curtain, a clear shower curtain. And she draped that shower curtain like all around her, and she hugged her grandmother. Her grandmother hadn't had a hug in months. This was so important. So creativity is so important to do during this time. Other things that people are doing to keep their community safe. And again, we're talking about what's happening in your school or your community, but I also want to remind you that we want to make sure that you are safe. We want to make sure that you are doing the things that are keeping you safe. Because again, you play a leading role in your family, in your community, in your school. So that's really important. Well, just before we close this part off, we'll see, is there anything else that people have that they're doing? Yeah, the shower curtain did bring tears to my eyes. When my daughter told me that story, she was crying when she told me. And the sad part about that story is she did hug her grandmother, who was very elderly and not very well. And she did pass like a couple weeks after that, a month after that. And thank goodness they had that supportive hug. And we've all heard and read stories about people who are dying alone in terms of their mental health and their physical health. It's just really challenging. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of things. And the chat is really for all of you too. And I want to just pivot a little bit to look at what's going on around the racial equity, social justice issues, or reawakening, as I like to call it. I think I shared earlier that I've been doing a lot of reading about it and just re-educating myself on the simple things. Like, for instance, you know, just using proper terms. We used to use terms like master bedroom. We don't use that anymore. Now you use primary bedroom. And little things like that maybe are not so little. And also just understanding what these are all about. And I want to ask what's happening in your community around these equity issues, these racial and social justice issues that maybe will be helpful for other people to know about and to learn about. So I'll ask you just to type in about that, any kind of issues, programs that you're creating, programs you're thinking about creating. Just take a second if anyone wants to write in about that. Perhaps someone's writing in something long and we don't see it now. But I think the reality is that the people who are on this chat now, you guys are really creative people. This is why you do what you do. So I see we're reading the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Yeah, that's so good. And, you know, I think it's really important, David's talking about his AmeriCorps team, that in your workplace, you know, maybe you're all going to read a book and talk about it. That's so important to do. Countering unconscious bias is so important to do. Cultural competency committee is so important too, and long overdue. This is really long overdue, and I call it kind of a reawakening. We all should have been doing this, and I felt pretty guilty about that. Some of the things I haven't been doing, but it's never too late. We can't beat ourselves up over these things. And really talking about like how we want to go forward. This is so important. And again, this is happening during times of COVID. This is really hard to do. So we're going to do a couple things. So I'm going to actually skip to this, and then we'll go back to some questions. So, there are a lot of things I talked about here I talked about anxiety. I talked about suicide. I talked about self-harm, COVID. This can feel overwhelming. This can feel really just terrible and just dark and gray. But, there are some reasons to be hopeful. We're all in this together. That makes a big difference. When we know that other people are experiencing what we're experiencing, that helps us a lot. When we feel like we are the only person experiencing things, that's when it's so difficult. We'll come back to the racial justice stuff. I'm seeing more coming in. So it's important to know that we're all in this together, and that helps a lot. And this has increased, awareness about mental health and the importance of mental health. I've seen school districts doing things around mental health they never have done, and thinking about creating sustainable models around mental health. This is so important. So that's an important byproduct of COVID. And of course, one of the great byproducts is like, perhaps I didn't use deodorant this morning. Perhaps I didn't brush my teeth. You'll never know. I did my hair, if you can believe it. It may not look that way, but these are kind of things that are important too. We have to have humor about it. That's been a change. I know I'm doing less laundry since I've been home. I'm doing a lot more dishes and my dishwasher for sure. We've had some advances in terms of therapeutics, and finding a vaccine has been a national priority. I know there's a lot of debate about the vaccine and when it's going to come out, but generally speaking, we're doing things around vaccines we've never done before. And that is exciting. And that won't be the panacea. We all know that, but that's important to know. And the last thing on this slide is that you made it thus far. And that's really important. This has really been hard. We've had 6, 7, 8 months. I don't even know. It feels like an eternity. And we know we have a long way to go, but you've done it. You've done it. And perhaps, it's going to get harder for some people or easier for other people. There have been a lot of predictions about the winter that it's going to be harder. I actually think the winter for me is going to be easier, and perhaps it'll be easier on you. But you've made it, thus far in the process, and that's really amazing. When have we ever experienced this? This is so hard. I had a teacher, a school person tell me, how should I know about this stuff? This is my first pandemic. This is all of our first pandemic, and damn, we're doing really well overall. And I mean that in light of you're surviving. It doesn't mean your mental health has not been compromised. So I want to go back and ask you guys to type in any questions or comments that you have. You can see in the chat some of the things that people have written in about social justice, which are great, and health equity as a goal. That's really important, and this something called courageous conversations. But I want you to type in any questions you have that I can answer. I'll invite Dan or David or Randy to chime in if they so wish. I'm really happy to do it. Like I said, I do a lot of these webinars and communities. I love doing them. It's frustrating at the same time because I wish I were with you. I know when I've done things for teachers, they have felt very supported. I think teachers kind of got lost in the mix. They were hailed as heroes in the spring. You know what? Only about 20% of teachers want to be back in the classroom. So it's been really challenging for teachers, and not just with teachers, with all of us too. So any questions that you have, feel free to type in. We left about, 25 minutes or so at the end, not knowing if we'd have to fill it. We can get out early if we don't have questions.
John, as people come up with others, one that comes to my mind is, I think when you're talking about anxiety a lot and managing it, a lot of it was kind of would be true in any time. Are there any things you're finding, especially with the back to school? I mean, some schools have started going back already. Any early returns on anything that's ways it's manifesting differently, or
yeah,
that
very much. Well, let's start with this. Buying school supplies looked very different last year. Pens and pencils and paper and notebooks, whatever you're getting. Now school supplies are, Purell or Germex, if you can find them at all, and wipes. So it really started with that. Our school supplies are very different. So for the kids who are in school, they're going to school with a lot of trepidation. Of course, they're anxious and not anxious. They're excited to see their friends, but there's some anxiety also associated with that. And we know early on, mostly from other parts of the country, people's interpretation of safety is very different. We've seen this at the college level too. Some of the colleges have set up hotlines, where kids can report other kids who are not, upholding the standards that are really being asked. So one thing is, that looking at other people. We also know that you can't do any learning unless you're relaxed. You can't hear if you're anxious as well, if you're depressed as well. So I've really talked to teachers about attending to kids' mental health. At the elementary level, I've told teachers, if you used to have circle time in the morning, have circle time in the afternoon, because one of the things that kids need is previewing for the next day. And we as parents need to help our kids with that. So previewing means talking about what the day will be like, what are the demands, having a conversation like stand 6 feet away. Well, believe me, they will not be at 6 feet. They'll probably be at 3 feet. I always say to young people, you have to stand 12 feet away, because when I say that, they're really 6 feet away. Their interpretation of feet is really different. That's really important to do. And also not to minimize it. When a kid says they're anxious, they likely mean it. Of course, it's possible some kid is using that as an out, but for the most part, that's a hard thing for someone to admit. Not hard to admit that we have a broken leg. So we know that. We also know, I always think of anxiety like an escalator. And we know that we're about halfway up the escalator to begin with. We used to start at the bottom. It doesn't take a heck of a lot to get us up that anxiety escalator. And when we are near the top, niceness, learning, fun, happiness really are diminished, or they're out the window. So we have to acknowledge that. And I said to parents recently, if your kid wakes up one day and says, I just can't hack it today doing online school, the answer should be, that's okay. You can get your kid in front of that computer, but that kid's going to be angry. That kid's going to be despondent, and there's not going to be a lot of learning. Now, we don't want that to be an ongoing behavior, but we all need to have the ability to opt out. I know there was an afternoon about 3 weeks ago. I literally just needed to opt out, and I did, and it was very healthy for me. So respecting people who do that, and knowing that anxiety is something that not only students feel going back to school, but teachers do. Teachers are incredibly anxious about it, whether they're even teaching in a classroom alone. Other questions that people have?
John, one that came in earlier is a very specific one, going back to that slide with the iceberg. There was a term chandeliering, and someone asked what it was, and I'm glad they did, because I was curious about that one too.
Okay, come on. I'm going to call on the group. I'm looking for the slide here. There it is. All right, well, come on. Somebody help me out here. I know what it is. What is it? Come on, we got a smart group here. I'm calling on the group. We got a lot of therapists here. All right, I see some people I know, especially from other places. So yeah, so we're gonna wait for someone to come in. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think it's really important to call upon other people. Thank you, Sally. Hovering, yeah, like being like a chandelier, exactly. That's really important to think about. So understand that anxiety, this is such a good visual model for me. And I always use this with my wife. Say, remember, I'm the top of the iceberg, that sort of thing. I love what Dan wrote in. He thought it was wild partying. All right. This is your treasurer, guys. You got to be thinking about that. Like, this is scary. But yeah, so knowing these sort of things, it's not partying. No, it's not that. But it's really important to think about that. Other questions that people would like me to discuss? Thank you, Sally, for helping us out there with that. All right. So it's coming in. I just want to share with you some of the things that I've learned. I think I've worked with something like 1,500 teachers in the last 2.5 weeks, all over the East Coast. And I want to say a couple things. I'm putting first responders in there with teachers too. That Teachers and first responders really want to help. They want to do the right thing, but their anxiety is really becoming a very serious barrier to that. And they really have to reach out for help. And I say to you again, if you are struggling, please reach out for help. Sometimes people who are giving that care need the most care because you're giving so much. And we know that any kind of exposure to things, exposure to, say, suicide, exposure to self-harm, we know exposure is a risk factor. You guys all do it every day. And oftentimes you don't think about your exposure, but it's important to think about that. It's important to debrief. It's important to cry. I'm a big crier. And it's important to understand that you've got to be in a good place. Any other questions before I say a couple words to wrap up? Well, one of the things I've noticed about doing so many of these is that anything more than an hour, like who the heck can give anything more than an hour? This is really hard. What I want you to do now is just as that Randy's going to send a survey out, but just for a quick survey, if you could type in to the chat what you thought about this, if you liked it, if it was helpful, that would be really great and helpful to me. So just take a second and type into the chat what you liked, particularly what you learned, what you'll use, that sort of thing. That will give Randy a sense of things, and that will be really helpful to me also. Again, nothing big, a sentence or two or a word, something you liked, learned. Yeah, this is something we're all going to need to be talking about a lot, particularly the mental health issues. And I'm so appreciative of the fact that you all were here and gave me so much of your time.